A bad taste in my mouth, literally. Spirits as embodied senses in the testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. Therefore, guard yourself from fornication, and if you want to be pure of mind, guard the senses from female things. The role of the senses in the testaments of the 12 Patriarchs is extremely well expressed in this quote. Throughout testaments there is a constant fear of humans going astray, by losing control of their minds, and the author repeatedly warns his audience to remain in control of themselves. The senses form gateways into the human mind and should be constantly guarded. Testaments repeatedly associate the senses with demonic and other supernatural beings. While there is often a link between the demonic and the senses in ancient Christian texts, for instance, through the disabling of the senses and the body by demons, deafness, muteness, blindness, Testament makes other, less commonly seen connections, namely that the senses are both supremely natural and supernatural. In this ancient conception, good and evil spirits form an integral part of the 5 human senses, and it is in fact these embodied spirits that allow sensory experience. This presentation will focus on 3 topics: Reuben's anthropology and the sense of sight, Judah's exagamy and the senses of sight and taste, and Dan's anger and the disabling of the senses. A few words of introduction on the Testaments. The work is a collection of 12 farewell discourses, ostensibly given by the 12 sons of Jacob on their deathbeds. Though there are 12 testaments, the work is surely a single document. Though the work builds on earlier Jewish sources, the current form of the work is unmistakably Christian. The testaments are exhortatory in nature and focus on ethics and each person's struggle between good and evil. The ethics are summarized as keeping the commandments, which the testaments define as the double commandment, loving God and loving one's neighbor. Fundamentally, the ethics are grounded in the battle each person must wage against the forces of darkness. God does not usually intervene in this battle, and humans are not assisted by angels or other supernatural beings sent by God. So the first section, Reuben's anthropology and the sense of sight. Testament of Reuben outlines the nature of humanity. It gives us 8 spirits, pneumata, and these are the constituent parts of each person. They are life, sight, hearing, smell, speech, taste, sexuality, and sleep. The Testaments indirectly borrow these spirits from Stoicism, but interpret them in a wholly different context. Whereas in Stoicism, the pneuma is more like to the matter of the cosmos, in the Testaments these spirits take on a life of their own. They are independently functioning spiritual beings. After explaining this nature of humanity, Reuben then also explains how humankind's nature became distorted. Evil spirits have come into the being through the mingling of the spirit of deceit with these 8 human spirits. And the Testament implies that there seems to be a relationship between the first list and the second. But there seems to be very little systematic linking between the 2 lists. Though the original 8 spirits were ethically neutral, these latter 8 are clearly evil, and this demonstrates how humanity's very nature is susceptible to the influences of the forces of darkness. The spirits of deceit can abuse humanity's senses and nature to lead them to sin. Now there is one final vital part of Testament anthropology that we need to look at, the mind. Over the next 4 chapters, Reuben returns to his biography to explain how important the mind itself is. He tells how he saw Bilhah bathing naked, how the female form literally entered his mind and seized it, and how he then entered her tent, saw her sleeping drunk and naked, and raped her in her sleep. Reuben specifically blames the spirit of fornication for both deceiving and ruining his mind. And the implications of Reuben's biography are clear here. Once the sight of a woman enters a man, the spirit of fornication is soon to follow. Which leads us back to the quote that I started this presentation with. Therefore, guard yourself from fornication. If you want to be pure of mind, guard your senses from female things. The human spirit senses, in this case the spirit of sight, are a gateway for the vice spirits to gain foothold in a person. The vice spirits then can abuse the spirit senses, ultimately seizing the mind and leading a person astray. Let's move on to Judah's exogamy and the senses of sight and taste. Now the Testament of Judah functions to establish him as a especially heroic person, but only on the physical battlefield. When it comes to women, it's another matter. Judah once met a king who wanted him to marry his daughter Bathsheba. And the king organized a drinking party. Now Judah originally attends to confer with his father and follow his father's instructions about marrying a foreign woman, but he is soon led astray in a number of steps. 1, he sees wealth. 2, he sees female beauty. He then tastes wine, which starts to distort his sense of sight. The spirit of fornication draws up against him, and pleasure begins to weaken his rational capabilities. And then ultimately he comes to lust after Bathsheba. These steps show a deconstruction of Judah's nature, leading him from obedience to sin. His natural sense of sight allows him to experience wealth and beauty. And from Reuben, it is already clear that sight in itself can cause someone to sin. Judah, however, has always boasted that he is stronger at resisting temptation than Reuben. His downfall comes when tasting wine perverts his natural spirit sense of sight. This leads us to the topic of blindness and disability. Throughout the work, 8 of the patriarchs suffer a disability at least once. And this is always linked to evil thoughts, yet not necessarily deeds. Reuben has an illness of the loins, Simeon's hand withers, Gad suffers in his liver, and finally all of the brothers but Zebulun were sick unto dying. And in no way is this disabling or disfiguring process seen as metaphorical. Thus, also Reuben's blindness of the mind and Judah's perverted sight should be seen as physical processes. And this becomes clear when we start to talk about our third topic, Dan's anger and the disabling of the senses. The Testament of Dan makes most clear that the blinding is specifically of the embodied spirit senses. In it, Dan recounts how the spirit of anger works. The blinding force of the spirits of deceit is not actually a true blinding. In fact, it distorts the vision rather than stopping it. The spirit of anger, in fact, replaced his natural eyes with what it calls its own peculiar vision, wholly replacing his own God-given sight with the distorted one of the opponent. And this replacement of a God-given sense with an evil sensory doppelganger is accompanied ultimately by a replacement of the mind, which leads to sin. So when we look at the senses in the testaments of the 12 patriarchs, we see that gazing at woman, tasting good food, looking at money, hearing criticism or praise, drinking wine, any use of the embodied sense spirits opens the door for the spirits of deceit. The evil spirits have great power over a person. Their evil nature can disable parts of a person's body, and it can blind the senses. The Testament sees blinding not as a disabling of the sense, but as a replacing. A person's sense can become distorted, leading them to perceive things according to the spirit's evil nature. They now use the spirit's own senses. The spirit blinds, distorting one's vision, leading them astray, but it also empowers a person to do evil deeds. My analysis of the senses in the Testaments raises several issues. When the work describes embodied senses and sees various spirits as inherently part of the human body, the concept of the body becomes problematized. Certain aspects of the self become other to the subject, and not just any other, but a feared and rejected part. In Testaments, these embodied spirits are inherently alien, yet resolutely part of the self. They are hostile and dangerous, and thus the self too becomes hazardous. The collapse of the human itself as a bonded category thus resonates strongly with critiques of humanism from both postmodern and feminist points of view. When the Testament theorizes the disabling influences of internal evil spirits, it further problematizes the role of the body in early Christian rhetorical discourse and demonology. When the Testaments view evil spirits to be inherently human, the invasion etiology underlying demon possession becomes undone. From the Testament's point of view, the self is not permeable. It is not vulnerable to spirits, demons, cosmic forces from outside. Rather, the self is an overdefined subject, a corpus of selves vying for dominance. As various parts of the body gain control, these and other parts become empowered and dispowered, enabled and disabled. Senses, as embodied and independent spirits, can be used and abused as various forces of the self compete for control. The Testament's rhetoric, thus, evidences an alternative view of the demonic, one where all humans are, in a sense, constantly demon-possessed.